Hey there, welcome everyone. Hello, welcome. We're going to get started here soon. While we're waiting for everyone to join, why doesn't everyone tell us where they're joining in from? Welcome everyone. Please let us know where you're joining in from. Ooh, we got people from all over. Awesome.
Yeah. Yay.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
Brazil, Estonia.
Alrighty, well, welcome to Streamlining KPI Dashboards with the dbt Semantic Layer. We're going to go ahead and get started. So a couple housekeeping things. So we have a Q&A section. If you see on the right, there's a separate Q&A tab. So please ask your questions in that section. That way we can keep things nice and organized for the Q&A later. And then we have the normal chat. You can use that for banter, highlighting what you like from the presentations, things like that. We will be sending out the recording and slides within 24 hours after this event. So look out for that in your inbox. And then also we have a survey. It's in the doc section as well, and you'll find a lot of other useful links there too. But keep an eye out for that at the end of the webinar. We'd love to get your feedback. All right, and then the agenda. So we're going to start with intros. Next is going to be dbt's evolution, so from a data transformation tool to a data control plane. And then we're going to move into the dbt Semantic Layer overview, so where you can deliver consistent metrics anywhere. And then our dbt on dbt story, so we'll dive deep on our data team's use case for delivering consistent business KPIs. And then looking ahead, what's next on our dog fooding champagne sipping journey. And then we'll go into a Q&A. So have those questions ready for us. Whoop, skipped ahead. Alrighty, so I am Leah Hudson. I'm a senior campaign specialist here at dbt Labs. I'm that girl who's blowing up your inbox. So thank you so much for opening my emails, and thanks for joining us today. And I'm going to pass it over to your for real presenters. Alex?
Yeah, my name's Alex Welch. I'm the head of data here at dbt Labs. I've been here for about 7 months or so, and I honestly, I couldn't be more excited to be part of this team and be able to participate in all these solutions and really cool stuff that we're doing around data and the practice.
And hi, everyone. My name is Paige Berry. I am a senior data analyst on the internal data team at dbt Labs. I've been here almost 2 years, and I'm really excited to be here to share with all of you my lived experience of how implementing the dbt Semantic Layer has changed what I do in my day-to-day job for the better. So now I'll pass this over to Alex to get us kicked off.
All right. So before we jump into the semantic layer itself and the use case, I wanted to spend a few minutes just kind of reviewing the evolution of dbt as a product, right? We will go there. All right. And so what I really wanted to touch on is like how we evolved from this open source tool that was specifically meant for data transformations to where we are today, which is a platform that serves as this control plane across your entire data ecosystem here. So how did it start? For those of you who don't know, back in 2016, we started as an analytics consulting firm called Fishtown Analytics, based on a neighborhood here in Philadelphia. And, you know, we became known for producing this really crazy product called dbt, and it took off. And all this was with the aim to really help and improve the way that analysts work and go about their daily jobs. And then moving forward to 2022 and how that went. Well, we launched our own commercial product in dbt Cloud. We brought that to market with the baseline, still with the great tooling that we use for the transformations. But in addition to that, we started providing some additional features that were built right into the product that really helped automate and expedite your data workflows. And these included things like the IDE, which allowed accessible ways to author the code and to push and commit, ways to orchestrate your pipelines, and then all in with Explore, with the way that everything interconnected, it just helped really ensure the data quality of your pipelines all across the way. So today, as you can tell, we've kind of expanded across a plethora of different areas here. And we really do see ourselves and position ourselves as an end-to-end platform that uses the metadata that's produced by your data pipelines from across the entire workflow. And we use that to create this single plane that allows you to build and deploy. It allows you to explore your catalogs, to orchestrate your workflows, and really bring this level of observability to your analytics pipelines. And it's really exciting because as we continue to do this, it opens up a ton of really interesting cases and solutions that we can bring to you to continue on our mission of just helping improve the way that data is used across the organizations. But there's also this question, like, why even go through this? And, the simple answer in one word is really complexity. Nothing is immune to the law of entropy, right? For those of you with physics backgrounds, the second law of thermodynamics, I believe it is. But as your data practice matures and things become more complex, there's this need to really manage it. Because if you don't, things are just going to kind of collapse back onto itself and you're going to get right back into the chaos you were trying to escape in the first place. So in comes the control plane, right? We realize the fact that as more data is captured and there are more consumers, more stakeholders of the data, naturally more complexity is introduced to the system. There are more unknowns in the system that could impact your outcomes that you don't really have control over, right? If you're not watching, if you don't have that level of visibility into it. And so dbt Cloud as a control plane is really our solution for managing that complexity at scale. And this includes built-in capabilities that really help your data teams and their stakeholders participate in all the stages of the analytics lifecycle from a single location. And I think that's a really interesting and cool way to think about it, because without this, you have to go to different tools. You have to go to different portals to actually pull things together and correlate. But with this single location, you can leverage everything from explore to understand down and upstream impacts. Use the orchestrator to determine how your jobs are running, to trigger ad hoc jobs. And then you can also leverage the semantic layer as a real baseline for serving out your critical metrics here. Okay, so here we are at the semantic layer as promised, right? So before handing things over to Paige, just a few more minutes talking through a little bit of an overview of what it is and why it matters, and why we feel it's a great tool, and it's going to serve as a baseline for a lot of different analytics departments going forward. So what were we trying to solve with building the semantic layer, right? So organizations use a lot of tools, and when you take that critical business logic and you put it into those tools, it can really quickly lead to this metric sprawl. And in turn, this can lead to subpar decisions, a lot of confusion, and certainly a lot of inefficiency in this, right? So what's the outcome of all of that? Well, the first is that there's no confidence in self-serve. And so when people have questions, they go to the data team. And this has a couple of negative impacts as well. So going directly to the data team instead of self-serve, it subverts a lot of the system design and the purpose of BI tools and other tooling that you've put in place. It also creates a lot of pressure on the data team and their capability and their capacity, right? So it pulls their attention away from other work, other deeper, maybe more insightful work, and has to answer questions that, should be able to be answerable at a higher level here. On top of that, regardless if you get the right answer or not, it still kind of represents this negative interaction with the data team. I mean, they're the ones that built the dashboards, they're the ones that built the pipelines. And if it had been right the first time, this conversation wouldn't have been having in the first place. And that's obviously a very unfair comment to make about it. But in reality, you run into this a lot when you're interacting with various members of different teams trying to get their own actionable insights out under their own deadlines, under their own constraints. So, really keying in on that and making sure that we have good relationships, good interactions, can be solved not just by process, but by the tooling that you have in place. And so that's what the semantic layer aims to solve, right? It enables users to define the metrics in code based on your already existing dbt assets. You can query your metrics wherever your end users are, right? And they'll always get the same number. And I really do think that's key, because if you do lock away your business logic, but you need it elsewhere, you run that risk of falling back into that complexity, into that chaotic state that you were trying to get out of in the first place. And so with that in mind, when we built the semantic layer, we built it to support this robust ecosystem of platforms and analytics tools, really conscientious about the fact that this allows organizations of all sizes, right, to use these governed metrics across the different verticals, completely independent of what tools they've kind of coalesced around and what they've implemented. They can still leverage this layer to really take advantage of that. So with the semantic layer, everyone gets the same answers everywhere, every time. And for the business users, some of the key benefits, right, that we see are, one, it brings more trust in the data, right? So there's more confidence in decision making and a stronger inclination to embrace those data-driven decisions that we're all, and that culture that we're all trying to push forward. No one's really locked into a tool, right? And even if your organization or team adopts a brand new tool, because there's tons coming out, new technologies, things like that, you should be able to seamlessly tap into those centralized metrics. And then also by connecting through the semantic models, you don't need to be super technical to take advantage of that data. It's a YAML file that is in a certain structure. And that really obfuscates some of the, let's call it deeper technical needs to be able to run those metrics. And then for the data team, first and foremost, you get improved governance, which is huge, right? So you no longer need to manage this metric definition across tooling against different teams. And then you also internally, in addition to that, you get end-to-end visibility what this includes the models, the data sources that inform that metric, and then also what happens downstream from that metric. What are the dashboards? What are the services? What are the products that those metrics are feeding into? And those potential pipeline issues can be caught proactively, and the data teams can then allocate some of their capacity, their dev cycles, to really hone in on that ROI in the places where it matters, right? Instead of focusing on and treating every table of equal criticality, you now know which ones are feeding your critical metrics. And so those can be prioritized over everything, thus, helping with that cycle as it goes. And then by centralizing metric definitions alongside the data models themselves, you just get increased efficiency. Everything's in one place. It's versioned, and it's right next to the dbt code that you use to run your data ecosystem. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Paige to share our personal journey about how we implemented the semantic layer. And I'm not going to spoil anything for you, and I'm going to let Paige take it from there.
Thanks, Alex. Okay, hi everyone. Quick recap. I'm Paige. I'm a senior data analyst on the data team at dbt Labs, and I'm going to share with you all about how our team was able to benefit from all of the dbt semantic layer goodness that Alex was just describing. So last year, before we implemented the semantic layer, I was sad, Paige. I was drifting about in the sea of WTF, fielding question after question about why this source over here had a different number for one of our fundamental business metrics than this source over here. And we all know you can only answer that kind of question so many times and still feel a sense of hope. I was also really stressed because people were relying on me to provide metrics to high-level stakeholders like the CEO and the board. And when you aren't sure of your source of truth, it's really stressful to be on the hook for providing data at that level. There were some sleepless nights, possibly some tears, not the good kind. But then in August, we implemented the dbt semantic layer, and we put our company scorecard metrics into it. And we built out a dashboard that uses the semantic layer metrics, and I became happy, Paige. I was so happy because we finally had a single source of truth. And I want all of you to be happy Paige. Okay, maybe with better fashion sense, but I want this after experience for everyone watching this webinar. And I'm here to share our learning so that you can feel inspired and can get to success faster with your own dbt Semantic Layer implementations. First, though, let me provide some context. This is the data team at dbt Labs. We're a centralized team of both analytics engineers and data analysts. And along with folks from finance and revenue operations, we form pods that support different parts of the business. There's a product pod that supports engineering, product, and design, go-to-market pod that supports marketing and revenue. And Lauren and I are on the corporate pod, and we support finance and G&A functions. And we work on organization-wide initiatives. Side note, Lauren and I will be at a dbt Labs meetup in San Francisco on July 15th to talk about how we work together. So if you're in San Francisco, you should come. It'll be fun. So all of our pods do work that supports the business all the way up to the executive level. And our stack is complex with a lot of moving parts. At last count, we had 50 different active sources that feed into our data warehouse. Yeah, that's 50. Working on this team with these people is wonderful. But last year, the work itself was less than wonderful. And it's mainly because we lacked that single source of truth for our most important metrics. So let me know if this experience I'm about to describe resonates with anyone here. I support reporting our performance on our company-wide OKRs at each month's all-hands meeting. Last year, a couple of our OKRs were tied directly to ARR, or annual recurring revenue. So in order to prepare the data and the slides in the all-hands deck, I had to know where we landed for ARR for the month that had just ended. And we had multiple sources for this data. We had a Looker dashboard that was the original source of truth, but its business processes had changed, hadn't been maintained. We had a Salesforce report based on opportunities that had closed that was used by the revenue org. We had at least one Google Sheet maintained by finance. We had a Hex dashboard that was using data from a dbt model that had been recently developed by a couple of folks in data and finance working together. And since this was just one of the metrics I had to use to create these slides, I knew that it was going to take time, so much time every month. So I would block my calendar for 3 days in order to prep for delivering these slides. First, I'd go look at all the sources and see if they agreed, which they never did. I'd research the logic to figure out why they were different this time. I'd screenshot sources, I'd charts and logic, message multiple people in channels in Slack, sharing all of this stuff and saying like, hey, who knows the real number? What's the source of truth this month? And sometimes people would write back and sometimes they wouldn't. Folks were busy. Eventually, I'd get enough people in a thread to agree on a number that I could plug into the OKR slide and feel okay about, but never great. And then I'd watch with a sinking feeling as folks in the all hands chat channel would relitigate the ARR numbers in the slides and post screenshots and links from the sources that weren't in agreement. Every month, I'd turn my camera off, put my face in my hands, and think, there has got to be a better way. Fortunately, I'd also been working with my finance stakeholder on a source of truth dashboard that we called the business overview. It was like a company scorecard. And we didn't want it to end up with it just being a fifth source of truth. Plus, we were close to being in public beta with the dbt Semantic Layer powered by Metric Flow. And this set up the perfect situation to get executive buy-in to put the metrics from the business overview into the semantic layer. Everything it promised was exactly what we needed: consistent, reliable metrics everywhere, every time, from a single source of truth. And spoiler alert, if you remember Happy Page from a few minutes ago, you'll already know that implementing the dbt Semantic Layer was a game changer. But we learned some things along the way that I want to share next to hopefully make this journey easier for all of you. Now, a couple of notes about where we're coming from. We have a large, mature dbt project, probably one of the oldest projects out there, right? And over the years, we've created a lot of denormalized marks in our project. If you're earlier in your journey with dbt and you're implementing the semantic layer now, and you don't already have most or all of your data modeled into those wide denormalized marks, you might be able to skip that step because the semantic layer leverages metric flow to denormalize those combinations of components dynamically. And you can read more about this in our public documentation on dbt Semantic Layer best practices, which should be linked in the docs section of this webinar. So while our standard is to only make semantic layer models from our marks models, you might not need to do that for your project. Definitely start with the Semantic Layer best practices docs. If you still have questions about things like naming, file structure, et cetera, you can always join the conversation in the dbt Cloud Semantic Layer channel in our dbt community Slack, which is also linked in the doc section. Another note about us, we have executive buy-in to align on metrics definitions and encode those definitions in the Semantic Layer. The executives themselves were frustrated with the status quo and believed that the Semantic Layer was the answer. We started with metrics that they themselves care about, like company-wide metrics we report to the board, and we had clear owners of the metric definitions that we started with, which really simplified the process. It's really helpful to have a single owner who can be like the final authority, the tiebreaker, have the final say when you're developing and defining these metrics for the first time in the Semantic Layer. So some things that we learned along the way, naming is hard. Also, organization is hard. And the more folks you've got contributing to your project, the harder keeping things organized can be. And also getting the granularity of your data right can take a couple of tries. And if you ever get an opportunity to hear from Erica Louie about building stuff in the dbt Semantic Layer, take the opportunity. She's a senior analytics manager of EPD at dbt Labs, and she's brilliant and super experienced and did most of the work creating these internal standards for how we develop in the Semantic Layer. So first up, challenge number one, we didn't know what to name things. We developed this standard after some trial and error, but we prefixed our semantic models with SEM because it follows the same pattern as other naming conventions, like prefixing with FCT for fact tables and DIM for dimension tables. Makes it easy to differentiate between a semantic model and a dbt model. And we think the name should be reflective of your dbt model naming standard. So for us, this helps with our goal of having the dbt model to semantic model to metric naming flow be seamless and intuitive. Naming metrics was also a fun one to figure out. We have this pattern where we name with start with a noun or entity, action, adventure, or action or adjective, time frame, filter if we're going to filter stuff, and then also at the end we'll add on things like trailing 7 days or month over month. So an example here is cloud accounts active monthly explorer. That's the name of the metric. And what we're saying with that is these are cloud accounts that were active in a given month and explorer. And this allows for better organization and understanding around what the metric's actually measuring and categorizes the metrics that fall into subgroups around the entity, which means that when we look at the catalog of metrics, it allows the list to be organized in an intuitive way, which makes it a lot easier for folks to find these metrics. A lot of these tips are going to be around discoverability, because once you've built a bunch of metrics, you want to make sure people can find them easily. Speaking of finding things, organization was also something we had to figure out with some trial and error. So we organize our semantic models under our models directory, just in all of their own. They've got a directory, and then they've got subdirectories that actually for us correlate to the subdirectories in our marts folder, since we are building semantic models off of our marts models. Again, discoverability is the goal. And so since our semantic models are extensions of our existing marts, then they're easier to find when they're organized in a similar structure. For organizing metrics, we also have all the metrics in our models directory, but the subdirectories here are a little different. They're built to reflect the entity that the metrics are aggregating around. And then that makes it easier to see the metrics that are related to the same entity that you're trying to measure. And granularity. So this one was interesting. I definitely did this wrong at first. I pre-aggregated the data way too much originally, thinking I had to. It wasn't necessary, and it said it meant that I had to refactor later in order to add dimensions. So this should tell you a little bit, okay, this is a little bit of an eye chart, but this is like really good information for how to identify what granularity you want to be building your semantic model at. So these slides should be available later. Hopefully then you can all look at this more clearly. But this is a cool way to think about the philosophy of how we're going to, what exactly are we measuring, and what's the most granular point that we have all the dimensions that we're going to want to group the metrics coming off of the semantic model by. So I originally over aggregated because I thought I had to, because our logic was complex, but it turns out that like the dbt layer or the semantic layer definition features are actually really flexible. So you can do really complex stuff with some of them. And these are just some of my sort of favorite examples of some of the complex things you can do with the features. So, all right, so here's what happened. We put all of the metrics for the business overview dashboard into the semantic layer and launched it, first with the executive team and then with the company. And then the next time somebody wanted to know what ARR was or how many customers we had last month, I was able to share the link to the dashboard with the metric and know that it was right. Then preparing the OKR performance slides for the all hands became something kind of fun instead of something I dreaded. I started to actually have time to explore the data and develop suggestions for insights that the executives could share during the OKR overview section. I stopped turning my camera off. I started looking forward to that part of the meeting and feeling pride in what I'd produced. And when folks started were posting screenshots of the metric charts in the chat channel, the discussion was really more about like, what should we do to move this number in the right direction instead of why is this number different? There were a lot of benefits. There was so much time saved. Like for me personally, it saved me probably 20 hours a month. I mean, creating the OKR slides for all hands that used to take 3 days took maybe an hour. I also saved probably 12 hours a month answering ad hoc questions about ARR. And what's really cool about when you make a change to stuff in the semantic layer, it means that that change is everywhere all at the same time. It shows up in Hex dashboards, Google Sheets. It can save hours or sometimes even days, like tracking down and updating all of the places that the metric exists. Also, like the team, when there's like an issue with our jobs and some of the jobs are failing, and we can look at the lineage and prioritize fixing stuff that feeds into the semantic layer metrics first, which can then give us like sometimes even a chance to take a break before we go into the next, fixing the next stuff. Or if we're going to like build out observability or alerting on some of the models, it's really helpful to start with ones that we know feed the semantic layer. Then we can like learn from those learnings, and it's like a better ROI on our time. And what's really cool is if someone else in the company is doing an analysis and they use the metrics as the foundation, we don't have to double check that work to actually like really thoroughly verify their results. What's really cool is I checked last week and the business scorecard has almost 2,000 views, over 300 views in the last 30 days, which is like an average of 10 views a day. And that's 300 times in the last month that people didn't need to ask the data team, what's the real number for ARR? It's awesome. But here's some like really interesting additional benefits. So something I really want to point out is that putting metrics into the dbt semantic layer doesn't mean the number in the semantic layer will never be wrong. It's not like magic like that. Business processes will change, data will still get messed up in unexpected ways you're not testing for. But what it does mean is that since all eyes are on these metrics, if something does look strange, you're going to hear about it right away. And this is really important. The effort you spend troubleshooting and updating those metrics is never wasted. Like you'll know that you're not wasting time fixing something that's wrong because no one actually uses it, but no one knew to tell you, or was built for an ad hoc purpose and isn't supposed to be correct a whole year later. So when you're working on metrics in the semantic layer, you know you're working on the right thing. And when we spend too much time working on the wrong things or those perennial problems with no solution, it can really sap our motivation. And our motivation to do good work is like a precious thing. So protecting it is really important. Also, committing code feels different. Like if you make a change or an update, your update isn't like locked away in some dashboard that most people don't know about or have access to. It's not going to get lost amid the cruft. No one's going to accidentally throw it away or forget to use it and go back to the old version. Another really cool thing is working on metrics in the semantic layer is an excellent catalyst for alignment. One way to really understand how your business partner defines their most important KPIs is when you're trying to build the definition into the semantic layer. Also, people can use different definitions if they want to drift in their own little like ad hoc stuff. But if they want to change the official definition of a metric, it has to go through the PR process. And then we have a history. So if we have questions like, how did we define ARR last year? We actually can see it, oh, here in the code base. And like another thing that's really amazing is it lends legitimacy to the work you're doing to align everyone on a metric definition. If you think about the difference between saying to a busy colleague, hey, can you please sign off on this definition so I can add it to a dashboard, versus, hey, can you please sign off on this definition so I can develop and encode it in the semantic layer? I mean, it's like a tool that you can use to get people to recognize that the importance of your work, that what you're doing really impacts the whole company, and they really need to respond. So thank you all so much for listening to all I had to share. And now I'll pass it back to Alex to talk about how we as a company are leveraging centralized semantics going forward.
Thanks, Paige. That is, I mean, to me, that's an amazing use case. And I couldn't be more excited to see that across the team. And as we continue to integrate and federate data and insights across the different teams, I can't express how much more sleep I get per night because of this. So that's that's great, right? But now we got to start looking forward. What are we going to do? How are we going to use this as a platform going forward? Because reporting's one thing, and I saw a lot of questions in the Q&A going on about reporting layers and off of data marts and things like that. And I think one of the key things to understand about the semantic layer is it's not just about reporting, right? Like that is to me, that's like the number one use case and why you would grab it and start adopting it. But there's so much more you can do with this, right? And the reason you can do more with it is because it's sitting behind an API via GraphQL. And because it's sitting behind that API, it opens itself up to a whole slew of new use cases, right? So you can use it for building your own data products that can consume it. Or another way that we started to see customers start using this is through a way to operationalize their analytics. So their production systems, they've used it to start augmenting their users' workflows as well. So actually taking those metrics and embedding them into however they actually, let me put it this way, going to where their users are, right? And this can come in many different forms. Reverse ETL. So if you do have a system that, let's say you're connecting back to Salesforce, where you want to take the metrics that you've done and the things that you've created and push those back into Salesforce or some other tool like that, you now have a very easy way to connect to that. And if it's more bespoke than Salesforce, it's the same interface. It's that same GraphQL that really helps you with that data activation piece. This also supports and kind of goes along the lines when you talk about machine learning, right? If you're thinking about the machine learning process itself, there's this concept of the feature store, which is akin to what this semantic layer is. And those two can be used interchangeably, not interchangeably, but together, right? I think they build on each other. And one of the biggest gripes, I'll say, that I've experienced with doing data science work myself and talking to others in that area is data cleansing, making sure you have the right stuff, making sure you have the right definitions and the right context. And the semantic layer can really help with that. And then obviously there's the whole AI boom and everything that's going on, right? Because it's sitting behind the API and the GraphQL interface, you can start injecting that into your AI workflows, your data workflows, into your data vector databases, however you do that loading and that context loading, which then gives whatever LLM you're using access to the context through the metadata in the semantic layer. So definitions, dimensions, granularity, and then it also gives it access to the right numbers. So it doesn't have to make assumptions about what tables to use or does this actually equal that, right? So you're really kind of putting on some constraints so that your LLM can be as efficient as possible. So yeah, I wanted to kind of wrap this up by saying it's great for reporting. It's great for getting those right numbers, but we're in this world now where data isn't just a siloed operation. It needs to start being infused into every aspect of the business. It needs to be that augmented process And with the new technologies coming, the dbt Semantic Layer represents that layer that can really power that. And so just closing right now, I do have an AMA tomorrow with Roxy on our product team, where we're going to just kind of start answering any and all questions. So really encouraging everyone to come and attend that as well, because it'll provide a really interesting perspective, both from the practitioner side, which you heard a lot about today, but also from the product side and how we're thinking about like what that could look like, why we're designing it in certain ways. So there's a lot there that I think will be extremely beneficial. So I'll close with that. And I'm looking forward to this Q&A session. I saw a lot of great questions in here. So thank you everyone for taking the time out and listening to us today.
Okay, we're back. So we're going to move on to the Q&A section. Before we do that, I wanted to go over a few things for y'all. So if you check out the docs section of Goldcast, we have a link for a free trial of dbt Cloud. And then if you would like to connect with us about your specific use case, maybe if we don't have time to answer everyone's questions today, you can click the orange Talk to an Expert button up at the top right and get connected with us. And then we also, in our docs section, we have a link for our Semantic Layer workshop. So that is an interactive workshop to learn about how to use and implement the dbt Semantic Layer. And then we also have a survey there. So we would love to get your feedback on today's session, if you can take that survey before you head out. Alrighty, let's get into the Q&A. First up, how long did it take to set up the metrics? How many metrics? So we're going back, this was like earlier in the presentation.
Yes, that's a really good question. I'm thinking about when I was first building them, I certainly had to learn a bit originally to get the metrics built out. But I remember the very first PR I opened had about 20 metrics in, and it took me maybe like 3 work days to like actually build them out for the first time and make sure they were working. And I think after that, it started getting faster. So yeah. This is a great question.
Cool. All right, next up. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Two-page. I think we were really intentional the first time we went through and did this to be slow and methodical about how we implemented our semantic layer, down to the naming conventions that page covered, right? So like we got the first block in, and then we kind of looked at it and we said, okay, like this can explode on us. And like what is the best way to even use the naming conventions, to use file formats? Where do we even put it in the directory structures to make sure that as we adopt it more and more, we aren't actually, putting ourselves back into a hole of this kind of like just chaotic mess. So the first time I would say took longer, but that was highly intentional because we wanted it to fit with our workflows, with how we thought about things. And then we also worked with the product team to talk to them about, and get their insights about how they envision it being used. And then we were able to give our input back into it and say, okay, this is how we think it should be used as well. So it was a great opportunity for partnership for us as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I'll also say that sometimes the part that takes the longest is really nailing down the definition with the stakeholders. The part where you're putting the code in place is actually really quick.
All righty. Next question, could you please highlight what is the benefit of the semantic layer compared to having good and documented fact and dimensional tables? What's the real value of the semantic layer so it doesn't sound like a rebranding of quality fact dim tables, so I can sell this idea to my company leaders?
Yeah.
Thank you.
I can run with this one. And I think I saw some other questions that are, I think, share a common thread in here. I saw a question in there about, we have a reporting layer. What is the difference between semantic layer and the reporting layer? I think, the real benefit there is, and the sell there is the fact that it isn't just about reporting, right? It's that interface, and being able to use that API beyond just, querying for the sake of querying in a BI tool or something like that. Really, I'll take a step back. The way that I'm looking at the semantic layer for how we use it internally, I'm looking at it as like a bedrock for what we can do at the next stage. So there's the reporting, which is one aspect of the data team's responsibilities, but we also have all this other stuff that we can start diving into, and like, how do we use AI efficiently, responsibly, right, without creating more problems? How do we start enabling our data scientists in a much more robust way, right? How do we start integrating back into the systems that we have? And if you just have dim facts, if you just have reporting schemas, things like that, and you're writing queries directly against your warehouse, you do lose a little bit of that integration and like a little bit more control about how people integrate and how you integrate with other systems.
Yeah, that's really well put, Alex. I think about like the use case of our folks on the finance team wanting to do some exploratory work, and they can go into a Google Sheet, and with a couple of clicks, they've got the data like from some of the metrics they want to look at, and it's correct. It's already in the format they need, versus them having to, find the hex dashboard, click a button to download a CSV, upload it, all that stuff. It just makes the right data in the right place for where they're actually doing their work.
Yeah, I love that one particularly.
All right, ready for the next question? All right. Since you define many of your metrics on top of marts, how do you deal with a situation where the same metrics can really be calculated from two different marts? Example, a daily mart and a monthly mart, both providing revenue numbers.
This is so good. Let me think about that one for sure. I think there's like I think it's like we use the mart that is the most granular. So we can use the daily one, and then in the way we define the metric, we can actually just put in code. This is, and if somebody's looking for the monthly version, it's this easy. Or you can actually decide where and the end place where you're pulling the metric, whether you want to look at the daily version, monthly, quarterly. So when you start with that most granular mart model, then the flexibility remains like all the way through to, again, like into the Google Sheets or into Hex, your BI tools.
Yeah, I definitely think so there's something kind of interesting here, right? Like, so dim and facts, I think when you connect it to the SL, going at the most granular level is probably the best way to go. And then what you can do once it's in the semantic layer is you can do your aggregations there. So it actually starts to reduce the footprint that you need across your marts schema, right? So once you have it in the semantic layer, there's an argument to be made that you don't really need the marts, the monthly mart scheme anymore, which means less overhead, less management, and all that going on, because it's really just being derived from your more granular settings.
Yeah, exactly.
All righty, ready for the next one? Cool. What are some tips on starting to use dbt when you have a lot of data in different DB schemas? Do you start with metrics or specific DB schemas? What's the quickest way to capture your overall data landscape?
This is a great question that I think we could talk about for the next day, right? And no joke on that, right? I think there's a lot of advice out there, right? And so at my previous job, I implemented dbt from scratch. And so I took a kind of like a twofold approach. The first one was looking at what are the critical components that I needed to expose to end users, because that was really important, because you can build the best infrastructure in the world, but if you're not delivering to what the users need at the end of the day, you're not getting those critical insights out, those critical workflows, it doesn't matter, and you're not going to have a job for very long, right? So one, I would say start defining what those critical components are. Like, is it, you're going to have revenue. If you're B2C, it might be like customer acquisition. It might be account activation for B2B. You could have all these different components, but like you have to find the ones that are really important to your business and start modeling around there. And then if you take a step back and you start looking at it more holistically from like an infrastructure approach, then it's like, okay, from an engineer, what stages do I want? What kind of guardrails do I want to put in place to make this successful? You have your raw schemas. How much transformation do I want to do in like the staging before it gets to marts? And how much modularity do you want at different areas? And those are all components of what is specific to your business use case. So if I had to kind of encapsulate that and I had to back up a little bit, I would say really key in on the most critical elements of what you need to deliver and what is going to provide the most value. And once you have that, you kind of have that rough map, then take a step back and say, okay, how do I need to structure this with scalability in mind, right? So I'll stop there before I start, on my soapbox and really start getting going. So.
All righty. Next up, at the beginning of the presentation, you mentioned that you decided to use your existing MART data to build your semantic models, but that you might not do that again if starting a new project. Could you elaborate on what exactly you would do differently if starting from scratch?
Yeah, love it. I think about sort of an example of like, we've built out this big, wide, denormalized, dim customers table. It's got so much information in it. It's one of those things that starting from scratch, perhaps what we would do is instead of building out that big, long, denormalized table, we could do a lot of what we want to do in Semantic Layer, defining semantic models and how they connect to each other with primary and foreign keys. So that's like one example where, we end up with the same result, being able to pull metrics off of that kind of information, but we don't first need to build out the whole big, wide, denormalized table. And then it's more flexible.
Yeah. And then the other thing I think to call out here is that you can actually stack the models on top of each other. So when you have a really good baseline, you can then build another abstraction on top of that pulls from that level of the semantic layer. And that's powerful too, because you don't need to have those built in to actual tables down the stream, and you can access them just by querying them at any point in that kind of like semantic stack.
Yeah. Using metrics as dimensions is really a cool feature.
All righty. Next up, do you have any recommendations to metric discovery? Currently, we struggle both in finding the metrics themselves and understanding their definitions, as we have to constantly move from docs to metric code to semantic model to model definition, a bunch of steps and a huge cognitive load to keep everything in place.
Great question. Discovery is definitely an interesting one. A lot of what we've done with our naming conventions helps with that. But it's a really good question.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things to Paige's point, right? Like that's why we took a lot of time up front to think about where do we put from a code perspective, where do we put the code? What do we name it? We're pretty militant about making sure that we have our definitions in place within the dbt project in like the documentation files that we have, so that it does propagate down when we do look and explore. And I think, it comes down to like, you need a system and you need to have constraints to make sure that those things happen. Because it's when you're moving really fast and you're just trying to get stuff done, it is really easy to skip documentation, really easy to skip testing, right? And I think all of these things need to be like, if you submit a PR and you don't have those things, it's going to get kicked back to you. And I think that's an important thing to understand and embrace, and not look at it as a blocker, because once you have a good baseline and a standard for what that is, and then you have a good discovery tool like dbt Explore, like it pulls from that metadata and it'll pull it in, and then it helps kind of consolidate that for you.
Yeah, really good points, Alex. We do a lot of documentation on our semantic models and metrics to help with this as well. And yeah, those PRs don't get approved without the documentation for sure.
All righty. When whipping out SQL or Python, I sometimes use ChatGPT to help speed up development. Can the same be done with the YAML semantic layer?
What do you think, Alex?
I'd be curious to know what the use case is here. So when my first read of this, I took it as, okay, I'm trying to just like define some logic. So I need to use ChatGPT to like get that logic or that Python function defined and built. I'll take it two ways. If the question is, can I use ChatGPT or something like that to define my semantic layer and like help me build that out? That's an interesting question because I don't think I've ever really thought about it that way. I think you would need to do a certain level of prompt engineering where you feed it the documentation of the semantic layer to make sure that it has the most up-to-date version of the documentation as part of your prompt. And then you may need to feed it some metadata to be able to adequately derive the logic that you need. But on the other side, I think, and I mentioned this earlier, where I think the semantic layer in conjunction with an LLM could help you. It could help you build out some really interesting functions and logic that you could use in more advanced systems, like a machine learning pipeline or some sort of anomaly detection or something like that. But that's a really good and interesting question.
Yeah, definitely the wheels are turning.
Yeah.
All righty. Performance-wise, how do you think the fully normalized semantic layer, as per the best practices, compares with having highly denormalized marts running a simple aggregation? Meaning, is it worth reframing everything in the denormalized way if most of the metrics are already well-defined versus the flexibility or cost of developing a new metric?
Yeah, good question. Do you have an answer on that one?
I have a thought, and I think, and it's going to feel like a non-answer, but it depends on what you're really looking to do with your data and where you're trying to inject it, right? And what you consider the trade-offs, right? So like you can optimize a query, you can optimize a schema like all day, right? And you can continue to get better performance-wise, but there's always trade-offs, right? And so are you able to ensure consistency across your system? Even though it's like the most performant query there, but is that truly ensuring that you have the right metrics everywhere you want it? If it is, that's great. But in my experience, like it just, the sprawl means a lot of complexity in the system. Then it comes down to, okay, where else do you want to put those metrics? Where else do you want to put that data? If it's just like only care about BI tools, whatever, that's one thing. But if it's, hey, I want to augment my call center's interface with as much information about a customer that they're talking to at that time, right in their tool, then you're talking about different interaction points, different parts of like, where are you calling the data from? How are you calling it with? And then you're starting to think about things like, okay, if they're querying directly on Snowflake as opposed to this API, you have a ton of additional performance considerations to take in place there. So yeah, the non-answer is it depends on what you're trying to do with it in the long term. But again, I think the semantic layer, it provides that opportunity to do a lot more with your data than just having like a denormalized MART schema or a reporting layer just sitting in your Snowflake environment. Or wherever you're at, BigQuery, wherever.
All righty. Please continue to send in your questions. This one we answered in the chat, but I'm going to share it anyways. Is the Semantic Layer available with dbt Core, or is it a feature exclusive to dbt Cloud?
This is right now it's exclusive to dbt Cloud.
Alrighty, let me make sure. Do we have any unanswered questions? There's still a little bit more time to ask any burning questions y'all have, if you have anything. But let's go ahead, let's give it up for our presenters, Alex and Paige. Alrighty, oh, we've got some more questions coming in. Let's see.
Awesome.
Can you talk about how we can use Semantic Layer with Power BI?
So I believe we have the Power BI on the roadmap. If not, is that correct? I believe. I think we have, let me see here. On our documentation, there should be a list of like integration partners and who we can interact with. We are constantly looking at filling gaps of where like people are using their data, like trying to find the best partners and connect across everything, right? So like that's the idea of the control plane. It's not just for Semantic Layer, it's for everything, right? So if it's not already in integration, which I think it is, it should be well underway.
Yeah, Alexis from our product marketing team. Thank you, Alexis. She says, yes, it's on the roadmap.
Thank you.
Great.
And then there's also in our Q&A section, if you go there, she's answered some questions on the Power BI, if y'all want to look in there. This one, how's it licensed?
That will also, I believe, be through the website. I think I saw a question earlier about that too, and Alexis was able to provide a link to that that question. So if Alexis, if you're able to kind of drop that in as well, that might be able to help it, because that would just be on our websites for the licensing and pricing models.
Yeah, cool. And then probably last question, does dbt work well with Azure Git repos or only in GitHub?
It's a good question. I believe it's GitHub, GitLab. We don't use Azure here, so I'm not entirely sure off the top of my head on that.
Yeah, I don't know.
Cool. Okay, one more really quick. What's the missing feature from Semantic Layer that your team is missing the most, i.e. your current biggest blocker for something?
I'm really looking forward to being able to query Semantic Layer metrics in the IDE.
Yeah, I think that's really cool. I think if I had to look forward a year or from now, I think what would be really cool would be to allow people who aren't necessarily on the data team to effectively help build the metrics through the IDE in some capacity, and to kind of, in the true sense of democratizing data and the logic and the ownership, to use the SL to actually be able to enable that.
Cool. All righty. Well, thanks y'all so much for joining us. This is a lot of fun. Just a reminder, we've got some useful links to get started with dbt Cloud or continue your work with the dbt Semantic Layer. You can connect with us by clicking that Talk to an Expert button. And we hope y'all have a great day. Thanks so much for joining us, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
There's Paige with the hearts. I don't
Yeah.
have to let me do it.
Yes.
For some reason, my camera doesn't pick up on it like Paige does. It's still a heart, though.
This is fun. Yay. Thanks, everyone.
All right, thanks so much, y'all.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.